This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Hexbane's hunters are what appear to be a group of really classic-looking vampire hunters, loaded down with stakes, crossbows, and even a pair of very cute hunting dogs. And some of these figures you might notice actually have some very conspicuous broken masonry on their bases that some of you who own a certain board game might recognize. That's right, these figures have bases that seem to place them directly within Ulfenkarn, the Cursed City, which is fitting for a group of vampire hunters. It really makes you wonder if this is just an Easter egg or if maybe these figures were originally intended for a different purpose. And given that I've been spending a lot of time this year playing Bloodborne, I felt like this little group of miniatures was calling me not just to paint them, but to set them amongst the architecture of a Bloodborne, Cursed City type cityscape, which I happen to have a lot of existing terrain bits for. So getting right to work, I started trying to visualize how this display board might look. I've never made a diorama or display for my miniatures before, so this was kind of a new process for me. I first started arranging the figures on a piece of cardboard that came with the figures, trying to see what sort of composition would work best, and I had a lot of 3D printed walls and doors still lying around from a set of modular 3D printed Cursed City walls and doors that I never found the time to fully assemble and paint yet, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to make use of and show off at least a few of these amazing pieces, made and designed by local artisans Joey and Colin, linked down in the description if you want to get some of these for yourself. I also decided to use some leftover dungeon tiles that I still had from my Dungeons and Lasers projects to form the foundation or base for the diorama, and I started moving around the Cursed City walls on the tiles to see what sort of arrangement would work best. After a bunch of trial and error, I eventually came to the conclusion that a two-tiered display would be the best way to showcase all of the figures, and using a piece of foam core as the second tier of flooring until I came up with an arrangement that I thought looked good. At which point I realized I could just use another piece of Dungeons and Lasers tile that I had left over instead of a piece of foam core, and when I started having a good idea of where I wanted things to be, I started gluing things down using super glue. I left the top floor unglued from everything on the bottom floor so it would be easier to paint and texture everything, and rearranging things as I went, I slowly started coming up with the arrangement of pieces that I liked. As I went, it was extremely tempting to keep adding more and more pieces of terrain and bits and details, but at all times I tried to keep the figures close at hand so that I could make sure the figures would still be the center of attention on this board and that the details of the board didn't overpower the figures themselves with its amount of detail. For example, I especially wanted to include one or two of these skull shelves from the Cursed City terrain kit, which are extremely Bloodborne. You can find a ton of these down in the Chalice dungeons if you look, but everywhere I tried to put these things, it either ate up too much space or drew away too much attention from the figures themselves, so I ended up including 0 skull shelves. I'll have to use these for something else in the future. After much trial and error and a ton of super glue, this is the arrangement of pieces that I came up with. And with the basic pieces of architecture glued down, I wanted to add a bit more of an organic look to everything and fill some gaps, so I mixed up a batch of basing paste, using my pre-mixed pot of 50% acrylic black paint and 50% Mod Podge, and then mixing in enough sand to make a really nice thick basing paste. Using a brush, I laid this down everywhere and anywhere I thought dirt and mud would gather, anywhere that gaps needed to be filled, and just anywhere that needed a little bit more visual clutter or interest. The other major thing I wanted to fix was the edges of the dungeon tiles, which looked really inorganic to me and really stood out. So for the top floor, I bent and cut some textured polystyrene to look like brickwork, and for the bottom floor, I just filled some of the gaps with spackling compound to create a little bit of a cleaner look. I left all of this to dry overnight, and in the morning I cleaned up the spackling compound a bit with another coat of spackling compound and some scraping with my knife. I then filled a few more gaps that I felt were a bit distracting, and then glued a whole bunch of bases to stir sticks for some reason. Oh, that's for next week's video. I don't know how that footage got in here. In an unexpected twist of events, I then reached this point in the build where a package arrived at my door full of tree and foliage parts that I had ordered from Diorama Persepe. I should probably use some of these in the build, right? After fussing around with a few of these different branches, I decided on this one, and I tried my hardest to glue it into place with just super glue. And sure, I could have done the easy thing and had this branch protrude straight out of the ground, but I wanted a little bit of extra height, so I ended up using other pieces of wood to attempt to prop it up, making something resembling a root system. But of course, if there's a tree up top, it wouldn't make sense if the roots didn't extend below the ground as well. So I took a few more pieces of tree and created some roots down below where the roots would be of the tree on top. Even having a few pieces stuck through the bars on the lower level where I accidentally broke the bars. Once everything was glued into place, I thought I should probably seal the tree pieces before painting them, as sometimes wood can be quite porous and hard to prime with an airbrush. So I once again took out my mixture of Mod Podge, black paint, and sand, and I mixed in about 50% more Mod Podge to create a mixture that was mostly Mod Podge and just a little bit of paint and sand. I did this so that the wooden bits wouldn't look completely like they've been covered in sand, but still retained a little bit of texture, and the Mod Podge serves as a sealant so it's easier to paint on top of the trees. After the Mod Podge had fully dried, I wanted to flesh out the trees a little bit more, so I added some bits of dried sea foam, I think is what it's called, to the ends of the branches to look like smaller little branches growing out of the larger ones. So at this point you might be thinking, Dana, this is getting pretty elaborate. How many different products and tools are you going to use in this video, and where did you get all this stuff? And for that, I totally apologize, and as part of that apology, I decided to add an entire page to my website that provides a visual reference as well as links to where I got every piece of plastic, resin, and foliage that I used in this video. And it was extremely quick and easy to put this page together using this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform that I've been using for over a decade now for all of my website needs, and whether I need to build a store, a portfolio, or a reference document for hobby purposes, Squarespace is my tool of choice for any website that I might need, as it's extremely easy to use and even easier to add on to. For instance, when making a page full of reference links for this video, all I had to do was select a template, take the photos that I needed, drag them into the uploader, and then add any text or links that I want, and that's it. It's done. So if you need a website for any reason, why not go and check out squarespace.com today and play around with one of their free templates. And when you're ready to go live, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howell for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Once this had fully dried, it was finally time to paint everything. And I started off with just a standard matte black prime through my airbrush over the whole thing. After this, I then used a 50-50 mix of Citadel Contrast Storm Vermin and airbrush thinner to slowly build up a mid-tone on the figures and just to get a feel for what the lighting might look like. After this, I loaded up my airbrush with white primer and started the real highlight phase. And my goal here was just to make the figures look like they were being lit by moonlight from above, but also to have the torch as a really major piece of object's source lighting, so highlighting a lot around the torch and all the things the torch might hit. And once this was done, I picked up the figures individually and highlighted the areas on the individual figures that I wasn't able to hit when they were fixed to the board. And once I was done, this was the result. And even without color, it was really exciting to see the piece start to come together, and I'm already really happy with the result at this point. After this, it was time to add the initial colors, and I started off by blocking in all of the areas that weren't going to be lit by torchlight, with one of my new favorite cyan colors, Citadel Contrast Croxagore scales. I thinned this down a lot with airbrush thinner and just glazed it on in really thin layers, building up the tones that I wanted slowly over time. With large pieces like this, I find the best way to approach them for me is to use really thin layers, and then if you realize you're starting to make a mistake, it's easy to fix it because you're just going really slow and steady. The entire diorama got a good amount of this color, but I tried to leave some empty space around the torch and the areas that would be lit by the torch. After this, I used a thinned down Iyanden yellow to paint all of the areas that are lit by the torch. And if you're wondering how I knew where to put the torch light, I just tried to mentally conjure an orb around the center of the torch, and everything within that orb I just tried to paint in this color, with less and less of the light reaching the areas further away from the orb. Finally, using the third color in my CMYK painting method, go and check out my video on CMYK if you don't know what I'm talking about. I broke out my magenta of choice, Dalerowny fluorescent pink, and attempted to tint the yellow into a bit more of a warm orange feel using the pink. I also just added bits of magenta to a lot of the external areas at this point just to add some variety to the colors, but to be honest, I think I went a little bit too far here with the magenta, as I often do. So I went back in with some thinned down cyan just to tint things back down into more of a midnight blue range. With the initial tones in place, honestly, I feel like we could probably call this piece done and move on to the next project, but I wasn't quite satisfied yet, so I brought the whole thing back to my painting desk for another round of manual shading and highlights. For the shadows on everything, I used a really controlled wash of Army Painter Dark Tone, and I used this to just give some deeper shadows to the most recessed parts on all of the models. And for the really bright highlights, especially those on Haskell Hexbane himself and his torch, I used So Flat Titanium White. While doing this, I really tried to exaggerate the highlights, as I know I'm going to be adding more glazes on top of this later, and I just tried to go as bright and as vibrant as I could, adding little bits of highlights to anything that would be hit by that torchlight. I then applied a dark wash to pretty much all of the stonework on the diorama to get those recessed areas really shaded in properly. Once this was dry, I then used a dry brush of pale sand to bring some brightness back to everything and to help all of these really great textures on all of the models and the diorama really stand out. After the dry brush and wash, you can really see a lot of the color and vibrancy is gone from the diorama, and while all the nice textures are highlighted and shaded now, everyone kind of looks like statues. So after this, I broke out a lot of my contrast paints and just painted everyone in more or less the colors they are illustrated with on the cards. I'm not going to go into extreme detail here on the colors that I used, as it's not really going to matter much in the end, as I'm going to do another lighting pass on these figures with the airbrush. But I will note that I tried to keep the layers as transparent as possible so that the lighting that we already established would still show through. And nowhere is this more apparent than with Haskell Hexbane himself, where I used a yellow glaze to paint half of the figure to really drive home that object source lighting from the torch. I blocked in some of the colors for the rest of his outfit really loosely, and then I applied a thinned down cyan glaze over all of the parts of him that weren't affected by the torch to really exaggerate that lighting. At this point, I was really happy with how things were looking, but a lot of the really exaggerated vibrant lighting had been lost. So I thought it was a good time to do another pass with my airbrush to bring back some of that really saturated lighting that I wanted to achieve. For step 1, I used some thinned down Iyanden yellow to really bring that saturated warm light back into the area around the torch, as well as all of the parts of the figures that would be hit by it. And after this, I applied yet another cyan glaze to all of the parts of the figures not hit by the torch to help bring all of the various colors of the figures that I painted back into more of a consistent range with one another, and also just to bring a more vibrant tone back into the diorama as a whole. And you can see at this point that even when removed from the diorama, these figures all look really cool and cohesive as a warband, at least I think so. And at this point I decided I was happy with how the diorama was looking, but thought that maybe it could use a backdrop behind it to help bring in some additional colors and to help contrast the existing tones. So cutting a piece of foam core to the size of the diorama, I primed part of it in black and the other part in white, making sure to apply these very roughly to look sort of like clouds. And once that was done, I applied successive glazes of magenta and yellow to attempt to get a sky that looks like the sky we see in a lot of the Cursed City artwork. However, when I matched this up with the diorama, it didn't really quite look right. If the sky was more red looking, we would expect the figures to probably have more of a red lighting on them. So I tried to make the sky a little bit darker using cyan and magenta glazes, but it still didn't quite look right. The sky was much too bright compared to the sunset lighting of the backdrop, so I tried two different things. First, I painted a moon in the sky using some white paint to really drive home that this was set at night, and then using a magenta glaze, I attempted to tint the tops of everything with just a bit of a magenta hue to match the lighting that we would expect from a bright red night sky. After this, I spent a few hours refining things using the same process as before. I did a lot of edge highlighting using pale sand, and then used thin down contrast paints to glaze over top of these highlights to accentuate the lighting where I wanted it in different places. To be quite honest, I could keep on doing this forever, adding more highlights and more glazes, continuing to blend things until they are more and more perfect, but really, I just wanted to get this project done in time for Halloween, so for now, let's call this diorama / micro display board complete. You might also notice that I left the sides of this diorama open for expansion in the future. My concept here is that I could easily do more of these micro display boards and create a whole shelf of them in the future, although it also looks good just on its own, I think. Thank you so much to Squarespace for sponsoring this video, and thank you to all of my lovely patrons for your ongoing support and encouragement. I really appreciate it. And today I would especially like to thank JT, Sochilex, Strange Devices, and That Tabletop Guy. Have a very happy spooky season, and I will see you in the next video.